Now available in paperback and e-readers, Spellbound, A Darker Shade of Black. Get your copy today at your favorite online bookseller. Hollywood Historical Women in Crisis. I'd like to introduce you to another installment in the Hollywood Historical Women in Crisis series. And for this installment in the Hollywood Historical Women in Crisis series, I'm going to be talking about legendary pin-up model Bettie Page. All images in this video are used under fair use of United States copyright law of 1976 and are used in conjunction with my commentary. Now, Bettie Mae Page was a model who was an icon of pin-up photography and is known as the Queen of Pin-ups. However, this Queen of Pin-ups was a woman in crisis, and she was dealing with a lot of personal issues due to the dysfunctional home environment and other personal traumas she encountered when she was younger. Now, Bettie Mae Page was on the road to becoming that woman in crisis due to the home environment she grew up in. And in that home environment where she was raised by Walter Roy Page and Edma Mae Pretty, Bettie Mae Page basically suffered a lot of emotional and physical and sexual abuse inside of an extremely hostile environment. Now, according to some reports, Bettie Page possibly suffered emotional abuse at the hands of her mother, who Bettie, in one report says, allegedly did not want her. And I believe that Bettie Mae Page's mother possibly saw her daughter as competition due to the dysfunctional home environment she shared with a beta male father who was not meeting the emotional needs of Bettie's mother, and as a result, Bettie's mother was extremely insecure, and she was angry at her daughter for being young and attractive, and basically because she was angry at her daughter for having youth and beauty, what she looked to do was possibly, as I see it, emotionally abuse and neglect Bettie, and this basically led to Bettie having a lot of issues as related to later on in her life, because one of the things that I believe Bettie had as related to having emotional issues was that she never got love from her mother, and because she never got that love and nurturing from her mother who was competing with her, this is what led to Bettie having emotional insecurity all through her life, and she never got that love from her mother that made her feel secure in her femininity, and she also didn't get any nurturing from her father, who was basically one of these dysfunctional beta males, and this dysfunctional beta male basically did not know how to go out here and make his daughter emotionally secure, and as a result, this led to Bettie having a lot of serious issues later on in her life. Now, as Bettie Page was being raised in this environment where the family was traveling from place to place looking for economic security, eventually things started to deteriorate between Bettie Page's parents because the father could not go out here and make a stable life. The mother went out here and divorced her father and then decided to start working 2 jobs. And since she was working 2 jobs and unable to care for all of her children, she placed her oldest daughter, Bettie, and her 2 sisters in an orphanage for a year. And then the father, who was in the area, decided to go out here and come back to the family. And eventually, as he came back to the family, this is where Bettie Page's father showed how much of a sexual deviant he was, because instead of him nurturing his daughter and trying to provide her emotional security as she grew into adolescence, he began sexually abusing his daughter and participating in sexual deviancy by molesting her at 13 years old. Now, as Bettie Page was a teenager, she was out here with her sisters trying different hair makeup and hairstyles, and eventually Bettie Page, even in spite of the abuse, was a good student and a very good student, and graduated the salutatorian of her class, which was the number two as related to grades, and eventually wound up enrolling in college with the intention of being a teacher. However, she began studying acting, and as she started to study acting, she then graduated from Peabody with a degree in 1944. And after she graduated from high school, she did meet a guy named Billy Neal, who basically was a pookie, and she decided to go out here and marry this guy before he got drafted into the army, and she thought she could build a family with this guy, and that she did travel with him as a member of the military. Unfortunately, their relationship never really worked, and their relationship didn't really work because, one, I believe Bettie was basically looking for love from this man, but did not know how to. This man didn't even know how to love himself, because in a lot of cases of women in crisis, because they have dysfunctional male models, what they do is gravitate to men just like their fathers, and she just drifted into a relationship with another beta male like her father, and that relationship wound up deteriorating in the exact same way. And according to the movie Notorious Bettie Page, it says that their relationship basically deteriorated due to abuse that Bettie suffered at the hands of Billy Neal, and she decided to end that relationship. And as she decided to end that relationship, she also decided to, again, possibly give up on dreams of becoming a movie star, because she was dedicated to her husband, but the Hollywood system wanted her to sleep with other people. But Bettie, a Christian, did not want to go out here and do this, and that's why she was never able to become a star, even though she had studied acting and gotten a degree in acting, I believe, because she graduated from Peabody. And I believe that she possibly wanted to do this, but didn't want to compromise her integrity. So that's why things didn't work out. But in 1947, she decided instead of going to Hollywood, she would go to New York City and to become an actress in the theater, possibly, or in the TV that was just emerging as a market. And there, she wound up working as a secretary for the American Bread Company. And within days of her working and starting to look to build a new life on her own, sadly, Bettie Page suffered one of the greatest traumas in her life after being abused and molested by her father, being domestically abused by her husband. She became the victim of a violent sex crime where she was violated by a group of men. And I believe that really scarred Bettie and further led to her becoming a woman in crisis. And she wound up being so traumatized that she went back to Nashville for a while to try to deal with issues and work for a railroad, then returned to New York, becoming a secretary for a real estate developer, all while trying to process the trauma she was dealing with. And as she was looking to try to process this trauma she was trying to deal with, she was working at this office as a real estate developer, and then ran into a black man, NYPD officer Jerry Tibbs, who was a photographer, and he gave Bettie his card. Now, after he gave Bettie his card, this black police officer was one of the first people to show a little bit of love and respect to Bettie, and he was the one who, he suggested that she be a pinup model, and he offered her to make a portfolio for her free of charge, and he basically suggested that Bettie Page go out here and change her hair to the iconic bangs that everybody knows her for. And it was Officer Jerry Tibbs who basically created the image for Bettie Page's iconic look. And he was the man with the vision that basically created everything as related to Bettie Page's iconic look and helped her start her career as a pinup model. And Bettie Page, everything that she has, basically, I say it started with Officer Jerry Tibbs, the black man, and he was the one who put her on the road to success, but most people won't give him that credit, but I will give that brother his credit. Now, as Bettie was out here, she was looking to do all sorts of photos as related to these camera clubs. Now, these camera clubs did a lot of art style photography, which were these artistic nudes or pictures of glamour photos of women in lingerie and swimsuits. And Bettie was oftentimes booked for a lot of these different gigs with these camera clubs. And as a result of getting booked for these gigs in camera clubs, Bettie got a lot of attention in men's magazines like Wink, Titter, Eiffel, and Beauty Parade. And as she was doing this, she then started posing for photographer Irving Klaw for a series of mail order photographs which featured those BDSM themes, and she was considered to be the first famous bondage model. Now, as she was out here doing these photo sessions with Irving Klaw, she was also being featured again in a lot of these underground images, and she had gained a following as the so-called Queen of Bondage. Now, as she was doing this, she was taking acting classes, looking to get roles in stage and television, and she got featured on a few programs like the American U.S. Steel Hour and the Jackie Gleason Show, and she was acted in a couple of small films, but she never really got any sort of big exposure until she went on one of her vacations and met Bunny Yeager. And as Bunny Yeager was working with her, she then started to take some of the more iconic photos, like the ones with the cheetahs called the Jungle Bettie photos, and also the shot where she is sitting in front of a Christmas tree. And Hugh Hefner also selected her to become one of his Playmates of the Month. And as she was, again, gaining more and more popularity from posing in many of these nude photos, she was, again, becoming very famous and basically was becoming a photographic icon. And what was happening with her was, after a hearing from a senator looking to go out here and to try to copy Charles McCarthy, whatever his name, McCarthy. This guy, Estes Cuffover, he wanted to go out here and try to be like McCarthy and looking to try to censor people. And what he did was look to try to make Bettie Page a infamous person. And this was all talked about in the Notorious Bettie Page, about the hearing that she was requested to go to. And they wanted to make it look like she was responsible for all of this sexual deviancy, and they were trying to make her look like the image of sexual deviancy. What they were looking to do was try to demonize her for the sexuality she expressed in many of the nude and semi-nude photos that she participated in those clubs, and especially those that she did with Irving Klaw. So what they wanted to do was demonize her, not understanding that Bettie Page had already been sexually abused. And what Bettie Page, I believe, wanted to do as a pinup model was take her power by expressing her sexuality. And this was something that was frowned on in the repressive 1950s, where people were taught to be ashamed of their sexuality. And because people in the 1950s were taught to be ashamed of their sexuality, they were taught that sex was not something that people did for pleasure or fun, or to be taught to be comfortable with their own bodies. This was something that Bettie Page, I believe, wanted to do with being a pinup model. And as a pinup model, she was looking to try to go out here and feel safe about expressing the sexuality that she was taught to be ashamed of, with sexual abuse and with the domestic violence she suffered. And that's what this opportunist Kaufner wanted to do. He wanted to go out here and exploit Bettie Page by saying that she and the photos that Irving Klaw were creating were a bad influence on people. This is no different than what they were doing as related to seduction of the innocent, also saying that comic books basically were something that were influencing kids, and this was something that they were promoting in their media. And I believe this is one of the things that led to Bettie Page basically winding up disappearing, as she was dealing with not only this case and being told about the young man who wound up killing himself as a result of seeing the Irving Klaw BDSM photos. I mean, this is what possibly led to Bettie Page possibly being motivated to wind up stop doing these kinds of photos. This and her going to Florida, where she had an experience at a multiracial church on New Year's Eve, where she became a dedicated born-again Christian. Now, Bettie Page was always considering herself to be a Christian, following the Most High God, and she always thought that she was just doing the work of the Lord by participating in doing these photos. But I believe that what happened was that she got this revelation and wanted to really commit and dedicate herself to God. And she went out here looking to try to first become a missionary and tried to reconcile with her husband and to become a missionary. But when that didn't work, she then married a guy and then wound up divorcing him, and then wound up marrying for a third time in 1967. And it seems like in 1967, in that marriage to Harry Lear, a single father with children, this is where Bettie Page's mental health started to deteriorate. And I believe one of the reasons why Bettie Page's mental health started to deteriorate is because at that point she was dealing with the whole failure of being that missionary that she wanted to do, doing service to the Lord. And because she was frustrated about that and frustrated about several failed marriages, this is what led to her mental health starting to deteriorate. And then she also had to deal with the DNA and spirits of these men being inside of her and winding up creating conflict inside of herself, because when a woman goes out here and has sex with men, and when you have sex with men through abusive trauma, what happens is that woman is trying to process all of that trauma from all of those spirits, from that sexual violence. And I believe this is what led to Bettie Page's mental health deteriorating as she was dealing with all these spirits inside of her. And this is what led to her having these bouts of anger where she was exploding in rage, as alleged in one incident where she ran through a Boca Raton ministry with a .22 caliber pistol in 1972 of January, and in April she forced her husband and her children at knife point to pray to Jesus. I believe that her mental health was deteriorating because she was dealing with all of this trauma as related to the sexual abuse of her father, the domestic violence of her husband, and the sexual violation by those men in New York City. I believe that she was feeling powerless in the third marriage to the third man. And again, she had conflict from the three spirits of the other husbands. And all of this led to her mental health, I believe, deteriorating. And this is what led to her being committed to Jackson Memorial for 4 months. And Bettie Page, still not feeling right, decided to recommit herself in October, where she was left under suicide watch. And then around 1978, this is where her third husband, Harry Lear, decided to separate from her and eventually wound up divorcing her. And that's when Bettie Page decided to move on with her life, hoping to have a relationship with her brother. Unfortunately, her mental health was still further deteriorating because of all of those different conflicts of spirit. And as a result of those conflicts of spirit inside of her, as related to all of the trauma she had endured in her life, she had an argument with a landlady and she assaulted her with a knife. And that's when Bettie Page was diagnosed with schizophrenia and sentenced to Patton State Hospital for 20 months. And this was an episode that basically started to see that her mental health was falling apart. And the next attack was the worst of all. This is where Bettie Page repeatedly stabbed a landlady, allegedly 20 times, and even cut off one of her fingers and sliced her face from the mouth up to the ear. And as a result, this is where Bettie Page was found innocent by reason of insanity in a trial, sentenced to 10 years into a California hospital. And this is where Bettie wound up becoming a woman who was in crisis and struggling with mental health issues, and wound up sitting there alone with nobody to love her. And that is the worst thing to happen to Bettie Page, because this was a woman who basically all she wanted was love in her life. All she wanted was for somebody to love her, but never wound up running into anyone who loved her. Sadly, all she ran into were people who were looking to use and exploit her. And that's sadly the saddest part of Bettie Page's story. She was a woman who was basically being used and exploited for many years. And as she was being used and exploited and struggling to try to build a life, people were taking advantage of her image. And as they were taking advantage of her image, they were going out here making money at her expense as she suffered in poverty in mental hospitals. Now, Bettie Page had her photos basically all over the world for the last 30 to 40 years, and as she had her photos all over the world for the last 30 to 40 years, she was basically becoming a cult icon, but she was never receiving any of the money for that image, and that image was basically making lots of people money, but she wasn't making a dime as a result. And it wasn't until the 90s that Hugh Hefner, the man who had her featured as one of his early Playboy playmates, decided to go get justice for Bettie Page, and he set up her getting an agent, and he also set up where she could get royalties as related to her image. And Bettie Page, while she was a poor woman in crisis for many years, finally was starting to get the help that she needed in her older age. And as she was starting to get help in her older age, she was able to finally start building the life that she had wanted all the way back in the 40s, and finally managed to get a little bit of peace when she got older. Now, Bettie Page, to protect her image, decided to go out here and not let people take many pictures of her because she didn't want her image out there. She wanted people to remember her like she was in the past. And a lot of people still thought Bettie Page was dead back in the 70s and the 80s, but she was alive in that mental hospital dealing with her mental health. And as she was dealing with her mental health, a following was coming around because a comic artist named Dave Stevens created a character inspired by her for his comic, The Rocketeer. And as she was out here, people were remembering who she was. And thank God Hugh Hefner was there to actually help her be able to build a career off of all of the old legacy images of her and get her royalties and basically her social security so that she could be able to take care of herself and help this woman in crisis finally come out of a crisis. But when I look at the story of Bettie Page, it is a story of a woman in crisis, and she's a woman who was in crisis due to a family that never gave her love, a family that never gave her care, and as a result of that family giving her a foundation of trauma, she lived with a lot of trauma and only got love, I believe, from two people, Jerry Tibbs, who showed her some love, and Hugh Hefner, who showed her some love. Now, I would say Irving Klaw did give her some respect as related to those photos, but he was basically exploiting her as I see it. But Bettie Page was a great icon of the pinup culture, but she was a woman in crisis who suffered as related to becoming that icon. And a lot of people don't want to talk about how she suffered as a woman in crisis. They remember the beauty of the pictures, but they don't think about the suffering this woman had as she was dealing with her mental health issues, how she had to take medicine like Thorazine, which left her in a daze, because I had a family member who had to take Thorazine, and I know what it does to people. And Bettie Page struggled with a lot of pain, and a lot of people don't want to talk about the pain of Bettie Page, who was an icon who inspired many people, inspired Dave Stevens as related to the Bettie character in The Rocketeer, inspired many goths as related to what they call the Bettie bangs, inspired many goths' looks as related to much of the fetish wear they wear as fashion, and inspired many people to take control of their own sexuality, and inspired many people to see sex as something fun. This is all part of the icon and the mythology of Bettie Page, who many people see as notorious, but I see as the people who abuse Bettie Page as notorious, and I see Bettie Page as a story of a woman in crisis who finally got some mercy from God and was able to live the last days of her life in peace, allowed to go out here and build an estate to take care of herself, and allowed to finally be compensated for all of her pain and suffering, and a story of a woman in crisis who eventually got the victory in the last days of her life and finally was allowed to overcome being a woman in crisis, and finally a icon that shows that you don't have to stay and be exploited, and you don't have to stay being a woman in crisis. Now, if you want to learn more about women and what leads to them becoming in crisis, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis at other online booksellers like Smashware's The iBookstore and Google Play. And if you want to see me do more stories about Hollywood historical women in crisis, you can you can donate to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App by clicking the links in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback. From the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Man Crisis, comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback at Amazon.com and online booksellers today.